Hello, I'm Chiranjib Sengupta and you are with me on the Energy Connects podcast. Welcome to the second episode of our special series of podcasts brought to you in partnership with Siemens Digital Industries Software. In this episode, we will dive deep into the world of model-based financial optimization, exploring a data-driven method to understand how companies can maximize their returns on their digital investment. To discuss this, I'm delighted to welcome back our stellar panel from Siemens. John Nixon, Vice President of Global Strategy for Energy, Chemicals and Infrastructure, and Mike Houghton, the Global Head of Sales, both at Siemens Digital Industries Software. John and Mike, welcome back to the Energy Connects podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for having us.
To start off, let's go over to the CFO's desk. Could you help us understand what are some of the emerging digital technologies and solutions that can actually help CFOs better understand the impact of their financial activities?
Mike, I'll take a first stab at this. So, when I entered this space many years ago, the term that you would hear is model-based systems engineering, right? That really came out of manufacturing, and it's really transforming the way in which we design and create these very complex systems. So when I look at that, I also think about, at the end of the day, any kind of investment in digital has got to translate into EBITDA performance. And you need to be able to trace that. And so I started to think about model-based systems engineering, and really what we're talking about is model-based financial optimization. So we talk about creating these digital twins. We talk about how it drives sustainability. Well, digital twins drive profitability, right? You get better yields, less waste, all these factors that go into driving the financial performance of your company. There's return on capital employed, there's cash return on capital invested, there's earnings before income tax, depreciation, and amortization. There's these different metrics that people are very cognizant of that you have to be able to drive. And I want to create, and I want to see evolve, and I'm seeing it evolve in the world of oil and gas and in the world of energy at large, how we can look at field operations, we can look at digital investments we make, and we can directly trace that optimized performance back to the balance sheet. And so I challenge organizations and I ask them, do you know that for every dollar of X digital spend that you make, what that translates to in EBITDA performance, return on capital employed, cash return on capital invested? This is in our earlier podcast, we talked about business process optimization, about understanding kind of like a snapshot of where you are in business process today. And then understanding that first, and then making sure that you had a configuration of all the different federated data sources and they're all connected, and driving to create that foundation. Well, that's just not an exercise in better data governance. If you do that, you're going to find you're necessarily going to squeeze out inefficiencies, right, in your business process, which means wasted time. Wasted time is money. Money means EBITDA. And so just that act alone starts to drive better profitability. Now, as you go and make digital investments and employ that capital, you'll be able to better understand how it comes back to affect your operations, and that should then be able to be translated into financial performance. So for me, I would say CFOs need to adopt the language or add to their lexicon, if you will. What is my model-based financial optimization? What is my approach to MBFO, so that when my personnel come to me and say, I'd love to have you write a check for X digital applications, whatever they might be, naturally it needs to tie into a data strategy, right? Which is a model-based strategy, which then should drive financial optimization. And so I think that's much easier to do today, because with the digital twins that we've talked about, you'll be able to have visibility on the data. You'll have visibility on operational performance. You'll be able to tell yourself, well, because I deployed these reduced order model executable digital twins and invested that time, what did that directly translate to in additional yields, better, quality of product and so forth? Now you're getting an understanding of, for every dollar of digital spend, I get, multiple dollars back in profitability and so forth. And you can start to better improve what your shareholders and your board require of you when you make all of these investments. And the other thing I see too is, it used to be many decades ago, there was a recalcitrance, a hesitancy to invest in the digital, because it's like, look, all I do is I explore and produce oil. Okay, don't bother me, right? Or, I'm sorry, I'm out here, I'm already operating on razor thin margins as a refinery. I just want to keep the thing running. Okay, but again, our species' level of sophistication has changed, and the expectation is you are investing in digital. In fact, I'm not going to squeeze out that additional profitability if I'm not investing in agentic AI, if I'm not looking at working with hyperscalers to provide the amount of processing capability around my data to actually surface and yield insights that I need around my operations. So the expectations have changed. And so with that, a CFO's, let's say, view of the world needs to incorporate a model-based approach and when I say model-based, not financial modeling, but the physical modeling and all of this physics-informed digital twins that we talk a lot about at Siemens can literally be traced back to your ERP and traced back to your financial systems. And you can get a solid relationship between the physical reality, the digital twin, and the optimized performance that's translated into better EBITDA or return on capital employed or cash return on cash invested, or capital invested, I should say. So, Mike, that's kind of where my thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, it is another good question, and I'm building on what John's saying there. We have two main approaches when we go to market with digital twins and digitalization in general. Is some customers have already got it in their mind what they want, and they come out with some sort of tendering process. We've got an idea, we want this. And other customers, they're actually, they haven't got a vision of what they want, and we help them achieve this. In both instances, we've got to be able to translate it back to what the dollar saving is, right? Because in some instances, let's say the customer comes out and says, this is an RFP, request for proposal. And if we quote for this, not all offers are going to be the same, So we've got to differentiate our offer, because we're running high fidelity twins and the likes. We're extracting a lot more value out of the twin for the customer. And that value, if it's not realized, the customer could make, I'm going to say, an incorrect judgment. They could say, well, all offers are equal, right? So all the time, we try and build her up to say, this is how much value we'll create. So not only are we trying to develop digital twins of the assets, the production, the processes, and the likes, we're also trying to substantiate that with what that mean to the bottom line. What's the ROI? What's the internal rate of return? What's the net present value? Because these are the metrics that very often make it to the CapEx investment sheet. Say, where am I going to go? And we want to be higher up on that list than anyone else, so they're making those right informed decisions. But I will also say is, the customers have got to get away from that silo thinking about a unique point solution. They've got to start thinking about, okay, what's the ecosystem I'm going to put in play? And hopefully they pick Siemens here, that they can build year on year productivity and innovation performance improvements. So they're not just delivering that EBITDA results year one and maybe some consequent year two, year three associated with that. But no, they've got a platform now they can use to across their entire enterprise. That's where the smart money is. And really, we can help model this. We've done it plenty of time before. In fact, there are some instances this year where customers have said to us, I want to know what this investment's going to mean to my P&L, my balance sheet. So we've actually model their balance sheets as is, and then model their balance sheet as in the new scenario with 2B, showing them the impact of to their bottom line figures, our overall company results. So this is a really good question, and I think as time goes by, more and more customers are going to extend the models into, okay, what's the financial overreach of this? What does it look like? And what does that ultimate enabling platform look like? I'll just talk about one other topic we talked about in an earlier question in another podcast. We talked about, what sorts of gains people are making with this sort of digital turn technology. And John, you mentioned one about a 40% improvement in terms of productivity engineering hours to deliver a solution. And that in itself is fantastic. Who wouldn't take that? But, it goes beyond that. Imagine now, because you've got that collaborative platform where all your multidisciplinary teams are working on this 24/7, you're getting better quality. So you're reducing the amount of rework, right? You're optimizing the solution because now you can simulate. You can say, okay, simulate me not just I'm going to say the process and the performance of the process, but now you can simulate things like, okay, what's the CapEx versus OpEx? What's the investment profile? What's the time to value? You might get, one might look much more attractive, but it's going to take 18 months longer to do. So you can simulate these sorts of, you can then start to simulate the process in the steady state and the dynamic. So you're really building in quality and optimization at the design phase. So the 40%, right, actually might be the thin end of a big wedge. You're running an asset for 20 years. You might be unlocking a hell of a lot more value, John, with the digital twin than what's first apparent. And our financial colleagues, many of them are getting up to speed with this, and I just encourage everyone to really take a long, hard look of, what does digitalization mean to their business, and think of it about an enabling platform that's going to offer them the digital threads where they unlock that value across their entire asset lifecycle, from concept, detailed design, implementation, commissioning, operations, through to maintenance, and then divestment, retirement, right the way across. It really is, orders of magnitude greater than the initial 40% that people focus in on.
That's a great point. And going back to what we mentioned and talked about in the first episode of the podcast, where companies say, where do we start? So in this case also, could you guide us to how does a CFO make that call? And what type of digital solutions would a company need to invest in and have in place to start taking advantage of model-based financial optimization?
In I think a prior podcast, we talked about, where do you start, right? Where do you begin your digital maturity? And, we talked about making sure that you configure your digital backbone, meaning you understand your business processes that are enabled by digital. You've got federated data. You've invested in all of these systems over the years. So, how do I and, we want to stay away from sunk cost fallacy, right? We want to stay away from, well, I've already spent all this money. I don't want to just lose it. Well, sometimes, things have changed, right? Our species have moved on. And so the technology of yesteryear just doesn't work. But what I would argue is you've probably invested in systems that you do need and you continue to need, and we need to wring more value out of them. So, where do you begin? Well, you begin with that, right? And understanding what your digital posture is, right? We have a methodology here at Siemens where we can look at your current state of your business process, your federated data, and the as is, as Mike would say, and then how do you move to the 2B or the ideal, right? What you're getting to and what that roadmap is. What I would say is you add to that the understanding that as you're mapping out what your digital maturity cycle should be, you should be asking yourself, how does that feed your financial reporting? How does that feed do you have a financial aspect to all this dashboarding, right, that all this digital does, so that you can immediately translate better performance into the financial results because of your digital investments? And then show a tight show the causation, right? Not just the correlation, but I spent this on digital, this turned in this performance, therefore, ergo, I get this financial performance. So you begin with, as we said before, a current understanding of what is your digital posture, what is all your federated data, how do I optimize those processes, and then how do I link that to, integrate it to, or develop some sort of relationship between that and then what I'm reporting to shareholders and to the board, right? And what metrics are most important for me in that regard. Different segments of energy have different, ratios that are important to them. Cash invested on capital employed, or return on capital employed, or return on assets, return on equity. There's almost an endless array of financial metrics that you could pick from. If you understand what's important, I think it then becomes a guide as to what you need to be able to extract from the digital twin to better understand those ratios in rapid fashion. So, it's going to, right off the bat, you think, well, I need to integrate my enterprise resource planning, right, with my product lifecycle management if I'm an energy equipment person, or I'm going to develop a capital asset lifecycle management strategy, and I'm going to need to integrate that data lake or that database with my ERP system, with my enterprise asset management system, with my computerized maintenance management system. You have to think about, well, I'm going to deploy personnel, I'm going to order spares and repairs. This is going to cost time and money. Am I optimizing my maintenance schedule such that I don't compromise reliability, but at the same time, I'm not expending costs, eating into profitability unnecessarily? And what's the right balance there, and so forth. And so we start having these kind of conversations, but you've got to have a digital strategy around that to support that, right? Because without that, you're just, you're going to throw money at digital, and you're going to say, I'm just not seeing significant developments in increased efficiencies and profitability because you don't have a data strategy, right? You got to have a data strategy, which means leads you to a digital twin. That digital twin then gives you an AI strategy. Now all your subsequent digital investments make sense, right? But it really does start, to get back to your question, where do I start? I've got to understand my business processes, how they directly relate to performance, where I make the strategic digital investment that then I can link back to my financial reporting, right? And we have a methodology for that at Siemens.
Yeah. John, just building on what you're saying there, it's a great answer, by the way. It's hard to build on that because you're quite comprehensive. But I think from a customer's point of view, that digital strategy, it might be more apparent if it's greenfields, because you're starting a greenfield. You say, right, I've got a blank sheet of paper. I'll do this. I'll go to a couple of vendors, find out what I need to do. There you have it. But if you're a brownfield, maybe it's not so apparent to them. But believe me, having a digital strategy in a brownfield is equally as important as a greenfield. It really is. Those brownfield sites, you need a digital strategy. For all the reasons we were mentioning earlier about how you manage those assets, the integrity of those assets, deal with knowledge loss in terms of retirement, and how you can make sure quality is improved and the likes by codifying things through that digital platform and digital twins. If I go back to greenfields, I'll play an example out, and I'll build on what we spoke about in an earlier question. So we spoke about, for those that didn't hear that earlier question, about a strategy around a platform that allows a multidisciplinary team. That's chemical engineers, electrical engineers, automation, instrumentation, construction engineers, a whole load of multidiscipline engineering, process engineers as well, all working in the same platform. In this instance, we were talking about a potential for 40% reduction in terms of time spent on that design and improving the quality of that design. So I was talking to this client, and they were working on a huge project, John. It was a $4 billion investment over 4 years before they got a molecule at the back end of the plant. And we'd gone through the savings they could make, the 40% discussion. But I opened the discussion up a little bit further. I said, okay, let's consider the knock-on implications. So they've got $4 billion investment. over 4 years. And I said to the guy, I'll call Terry, for instance, I said, Terry, imagine you're investing 1 billion in each of those 4 years. So 1 billion is going to be tied up for years 1, 2, 3, 4, then another billion for 2, 3, 4, another one, etc. That means you've got $10 billion worth of net capital employed, essentially. Right? Now, if you're paying 10% cost of capital, that's going to cost you $1 billion worth of interest before you get a molecule of the final product out the back end of the plant. And Teddy said to me, he said, yeah, Mike, he said, there's, as I hear what you're saying, I said, well, that saving that I mentioned earlier in terms of the engineering time is one thing, but I believe you can make better decisions later by having this collaborative backbone, this strategy about digitalization and digital twin. And I said, I think it's the tune of at least 10%. And he said, Mike, it's going to be at least 10%. So I said, well, if you believe that's at least 10%, that's not only going to give you the benefits we've already spoke about, but it's going to save you 10% of that 1 billion in terms of interest by making better decisions later in the procurement process. And that's going to give you 100 million back to your balance sheet, just in interest payments alone. And to be honest with you, that was the key. That client said to us, Mike, we're in. Let's build a digital strategy. And we're doing that right now with that client. So it just, and I've just brought it to life with some numbers. This is what the difference means. Okay, not everyone's going to have a $4 billion investment, but those numbers work at every level. And that's just one example on interest payments, right? Not the engineering saver, not the quality improvement, not the rework, not the speed of commissioning. All of those things become super, super important moving forward. And then the operations. How then, you get fault in the field. The mean time to restoration might have been 2 days before, but now you've got a digital twin asset. You can rerun the exact scenarios through your digital twin and get to the root cause in a fraction of the time and restore operations maybe 10% of the time. There's a whole host of things that you can unlock with this digital backbone. But the key is having a backbone that allows you to thread across the entire life cycle.
That's a great point, but could you provide a scenario of how model-based financial optimization could actually benefit a CEO?
I look at my own experience in the field. You've got a company, you've got multiple sites, maybe you've got aging compressors at those different locations. Maybe you've got consistent systemic fouling issues around heat exchangers and so forth. And so you're always looking to balance your maintenance schedule, your capital investment where you have to rip and replace. You got to look at net present value. You've got to look at internal rate of return. You've got to look at the quarterly effects that'll have on what you'll be reporting back to shareholders or the board, and then your annual reporting as well. And so the beauty is a CFO can have a more direct conversation with the VP of engineering, with plant managers and so forth, where you can run scenario analysis across your portfolio now because you've got these very powerful digital twins. And you can say, well, hey, what if we pulled maintenance up a week? What would that, how would that affect our cost structure? And then what would be the knock-on effects for this quarter's performance, the first half of the year's performance, for the annual performance? So I think it really empowers a more robust brotherhood, for lack of a better term, a more intimate relationship between the boardroom and the CFO and field operations if you've made the right kind of digital twin investments and have, a more robust model-based financial approach to how you run your company. Now, I'm not getting down to the pebble in the pond where, you turn one little knob and you'll know immediately how it goes all the way back to EBITDA. But in effect, that's kind of where we're going here is if you take a systems engineering approach, the pebble in the pond approach, I know what the smallest actions will have and their secondary effects, their tertiary effects, those waves in the pond. And subsequently, I'll ultimately know if that's a minor or a major impact on finances. And so it's really interesting, the fidelity, the degree of how I can understand the smallest actions result in the biggest opportunities for us to drive financial performance. So, just as a real world example, if I've got asset integrity issues, and I want to optimize my performance, I'm going to balance maintenance schedules. I'm going to balance that against supply chain availability of both labor and material to actually perform the work I need. Because I might have to pull those heat exchangers. I'm going to tear them apart, right? I'm going to have to actually do the maintenance on them before I reassemble them and put them back in action. Or I may decide that, you know what, this thing has just got to go. It's rotted out. So there's real conversations that are expedited because of this. But it really starts to bring the entire supply chain into that conversation. And so I'm excited to see how these kind of real world scenarios can be directly linked back, both individually and collectively, then to financial performance, and it's very traceable, right? It has a tight integration between field and home office that I think has lacked and has been kind of this siloed environment. I'd love for CFOs. I'd love to see, or not just CFOs, but I'd love to see those that play a financial role have a better conversation with plant managers around the supply chain risk, and financial performance, so that both parties can understand what each other's demands are and can work better together. I think the digital twin really helps to bring them closer together, less adversarial and more complementary to one another. And I've worked at many companies. It's just kind of interesting. It's always like, you're in the field. I need more money, right? I need more labor. I've got to burn more man hours. I've got a deadline to meet. We got to get the first oil. We got to get the first wind. We got to get and at the same time, the C-suite is like, look, you got to do more with less. You've got to get there, but there's no more capital to deploy, or I don't see the return on this. And so I'm trying to make sure that if we take a model-based approach to this, we transform that conversation going forward. So, I think if you start with the most granular, what's my risk-based inspection program and how is that leading my maintenance scheduling, and how do I transform that into more predictive maintenance? Therefore, if it becomes more predictive, I can have better control. I'll know what the capital requirements are, and we can start to fine-tune our maintenance schedule. That's a very healthy conversation between the home office and the field. Mike, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, without repeating anything you say, I gave one in an earlier podcast around a master gas network where we had a digital twin running in parallel. We call it an executable digital twin. So it was running real time next to the real process, literally thousands of assets for the whole gas network. And we were advising the operating staff what next actions to take to move into a corridor of operation. And in that instance, the feedback from the client was, 100 million with a net present value. But, that's one example where, these tools are really helping CFOs in terms of justify, should we say, their digitalization strategy and productivity gains moving forward. But there's the digital twins, they can be used in all sorts of scenarios. There's another scenario just recently that I think the listeners would be really interested to hear. It was we'd designed a catalyst manufacturer had designed the catalyst using our technology, and that had gone online, and then we were looking at an executable digital twin to optimize that catalyst. Anyway, in the interim, before we went online with the executable digital twin, that catalyst prematurely aged, right? And they didn't have a planned outage to replace the catalyst, so they needed to regenerate it and carry on production. But obviously, the regeneration was going to impact them in such a way that they'd have a depleted level of performance thereafter. So what it did, it allowed the chemical engineers, the process engineers, the catalyst manufacturers, the operations staff to collaborate again on that digital platform to say, okay, this is what we need to do, right? To recover the performance of the asset, right? So they went through that configuration, and then they gave it new operating constraints until they got to an outage where they could bring the catalyst. And this is just an example. Without that digital twin data, right? That part of the process would have potentially been switched off. But it allowed them to go through that cycle, as it were. So, just another example. There are hundreds of these examples out there, but I'm trying to bring it to life in terms of what this means in terms of digital twinning. And in these instances, we're not just talking about physical assets. We're not just talking about process steps. We're actually talking about catalysts and end product, how we optimize them for the future. So I'm every conversation I have with a CFO, ends with, Mike, you've got my attention. How do we take this forward? Every conversation. How do we take this forward? And then it's where you want to start. As I say, got to get that backbone in. We've got to make sure we don't create data jails, or as you call them, data islands, which we're going to have a system in place that allows us, and a strategy in place that allows us to take advantage across the entire life cycle, as I mentioned earlier. So,
Mike, I don't know why it comes to mind as you're talking about these scenarios. Something else that's occurred more recently is, we've seen this nuclear renaissance going on. And, when I talk to my oil and gas brothers and sisters, I say, well, always look at other industries as proxies for lessons learned. And this may not be necessarily strictly financially focused, but it has financial implications. Right now, you've got a lot of new technologies being developed in nuclear, for example. And so they're literally designing the technology now on the factory floor. They're actually having to design the machines that then handle that equipment that as part of the assembly process on the factory floor for these small modular reactors, these fusion devices, and so forth. And so there's a tremendous amount of innovation and tremendous amount of capital deployed. And what I challenge these nuclear companies that are innovating whole new technologies, and I guess this gets back to your discussion about new catalysts and things like that. I then say, well, when you deploy to the field, how, and you're now building at scale and you're using contractors who have no background whatsoever in what you've developed, and they're expected now to assemble this. How are you're actually going to have to play the general contractor. You're going to have to provide that oversight, if you will, as a energy equipment fabricator and manufacturer and producer. You're now going to have to play a role that you're not really suited for. And so there's this extension of the digital twin into the field. And, when you go build these things, like, for example, in January 2023, there was an announcement that X-Energy, who an American company that manufactures small modular reactors, is going to be commissioned by Dow Corporation to build and install a small modular reactor behind the meter because of the 2021 freeze and the unreliability of the grid here in ERCOT in Texas. So, you look at that kind of development, and I posit with the nuclear customer that, look, you're building in a brownfield site, a greenfield facility to provide on-site power generation behind the meter. So you've got high energy nuclear in close proximity to hydrocarbons. What are you doing to maintain the fidelity of the digital twin around that, driving safety and reliability, as well as profitability? So, if I'm a chief financial officer and I'm going to be deploying all this capital, and I'm now going to have to oversee the capital deployed to build a facility at scale that now needs to be on time and on budget and make that, call it first atom in this case, as opposed to first oil, all of these have financial implications. I want to make sure I've got a model-based approach in my digital strategy from the factory floor to the field, because, I've got not just profitability issues, I've got significant safety and reliability concerns that are all going to affect, the bottom line. I mean, I don't want to go back to my shareholders and tell them, we're delayed another 30 days because of X. We're delayed another 90 days because of Y, because, I've got changes in the field that I couldn't anticipate on the factory floor. So I need design changes in equipment that's now going to be shipped out. I need that done quickly. I need to be able to fabricate rapidly. And I've got to be able to hold to my schedule of, first electron, right? And be able, because all my financial models depend upon it. I remember in times past, when I was working on very large oil and gas projects, I'd see them just throw people at problems and burn man hours, because it's like, if I burn these man hours, I'll get to my goal of first oil. And I was like, that doesn't make sense. If just throwing more bodies at a problem doesn't necessarily it doesn't increase speed. And it's got to be, this has got to be horrible on the financials. Well, of course, at the end of the job that I was on, you saw these large entities, oil and gas owner operators and engineering companies, and it's like a big claims environment, right? It becomes this, it's like every project has claims associated with it. Why? Well, for one, it's almost accepted that will happen because we're just going to throw people at problems. We're going to burn money we don't have, and we're still going to be off schedule. So if I'm a CFO, I'm like, that can't keep happening. I owe my investors and my shareholders and my board far better financial performance. So I've got to have a digital strategy to ensure financial optimization.
Yeah, I've got another great example there, but I don't know whether we're going to have enough time. But it'll take me about 2 minutes. Have we got enough time? Yeah, another example like this. So I had a situation just like yours, John. I was working with an oil and gas major. It was on a pipeline vessel, and they were they were struggling because they were into damages because they were late on the project. So they asked us to compress our commissioning time frame, and we had about 7 weeks worth of sea trials for our part of the portfolio. We created digital twin, and we expanded that anyway into a virtual commissioning scenario for them on the vessel that had all sorts of different components built into it. And what we were able to do, we commissioned this offline in a virtual environment, and we took the sea trials down from 7 weeks down to 4 weeks, and we were on time. We delivered on budget, right? And we delivered all the value for the client so they could get away from the LDs on this instance. And that's a great example. Instead of throwing people at it, we threw digital twin technology at it.
That's a very comprehensive overview. But one of the things that often comes up is the question of specialized training and skills requirements. So would CFOs need anything special to start incorporating model-based financial optimization into their planning and activities?
I mean, we have, for the majority of our offerings, we generate financial models that will articulate the value that we're going to create for the customer, right? Both in the, I'm going to say, the CapEx phase and the OpEx phase. So we develop both of these. And I mentioned in an earlier question that sometimes we'll even drive down to the balance sheet so we can say this is what it's going to do for OpEx. I mean, essentially, CFOs shouldn't be too worried about this because most of the CFOs are already managing their investment criteria around, who gets the highest score for CapEx and OpEx investment cycles. So they're already doing this. So when they reach out to a supplier like Siemens, we can support them in those investment decisions that they need to make around digitalization. But I personally don't think there's special training required because it is standard financial model training. I think that the key to the matter is that the training is around understanding, the art of the possible. Digitalization covers many different things. We started the previous podcast talking about, what is a digital twin? It means many things to many different people, but ultimately they've got to be able to translate that digital information and data into business acumen that hits the bottom line. That's the key. Can we take that business acumen, translate it into the bottom line? I was with a CFO recently, and we had 4 customer visits at CXO level. And at the end of the visits, the CEO said to me, he said, Mike, how do you remember all this? And I said, I don't. It's called business acumen. I've got business acumen. I understand how digital technology can impact their processes and their production and et cetera, et cetera. And together with business acumen, I can derive the business value in the discussions I have, almost ad hoc. Okay, I'm not giving them a bottom line. This is what it's worth at that stage, but I can be indicative. So I know it's probably not the answer you were expecting, CS, but that's it really.
So CS, to complement what Mike just said, I don't know if it's specialized training on the digital investment itself as much as an education on what is now possible because of said digital investments. And so it's kind of a know thyself moment. It's like, how do I bring the CFO, how do I educate them on, as I said before, an assessment of where the as is, and then the to be with the digital investments, and then, not just the art of the possible, but what is actually now capable of being reported back to that CFO. So I think it's more of an education on what they are now capable of being able to tease out of the data that's now being collected. And then what does that mean? I would say that, a lot of the tools that we have are becoming more and more readily, what's the right word? Easily understood. So let me give you an example. So I've got nine. What's that?
Democratized in the use.
What's democratized? But it's the ease of adoption is what I'm trying to get at. Yeah, I've got 9 high school interns that I'm working with this summer, and the rate at which they're able to absorb how to use our low code, platform to develop applications, tie that together with our ability to now project those applications to the workplace to collect data, and to then be able to take that data back and analyze it, and to know that they have absolutely no familiarity with my industry, but they're all learning this rapidly. And it's amazing what once you've defined a business process, how quickly they can assemble together an application that automates data collection and data analytics along that process without really having any kind of field experience, so to speak. So the world of the digital is becoming something that can be absorbed and digested and used quite readily. So if you're a CFO, what I'm excited about is these applications and our ability to show their efficacious, ability to provide value, right? The CFO, I think, very quickly will be able to see that. And it's more, again, just, do you understand your process that you're evolving now intimately, and to understand what you can get as a data and data analytics out of that? And I'm just sitting here telling you that the ability to absorb that and understand that, even at the high school level, it's just becoming easier and easier to consume and understand. So I think we're moving away from the days of like the 90s, when I had to roll out an ERP system and I had to have specialized training. We also had to design all kinds of customizations for it because it had to be tailored to match my business process, which then you found out was the wrong way of doing that. Instead, what you should do is look at your business process and look at how you can get more value out of reducing its structure, its redundancies. Why am I getting 10 signatures when I need 1, kind of thing. We had to rethink as a species how we are married to digital. What is our relationship to digital? Does digital come in and I customize, it extravagantly to meet the old way that I did business? Or do I rethink how I do business because of the capabilities of digital going forward? And I think as a CFO, it's about first understanding, not so much getting specialized training, but understanding really where am I at and where am I going and what now can I wring out of this system. So I'm excited to see the next generation entering here. I'm excited to see how much easier it is to be able to start to wring value out of digital, because we've invested more and more. Siemens is leading the way in that. We're investing more and more in the ease of use, right? The rate of adoption. It's very powerful. And I think then what happens is CFOs spend less time having to get trained on it and spend more time understanding the value they can wring out of it, if that makes sense. Mike, would you agree with that?
I would agree. The only thing I'd like to add to that is we often call it growth mindset. So,
Right.
I've been quite lucky in my career that I've always been curious. So the stuff that curiosity that took me to university as a young man never left me, and I've always liked to try and learn new things and exercise new muscles as a consequence of this. I think those CFOs that we've got out there and those finance partners for those customers, they've got to have that group mindsets because these guys are excellent in terms of understanding the finances of their businesses. They now need to complement that with understanding how digitalization can impact their business, not just today, but tomorrow, next day, and forevermore. That's really what they got to get their head around, I think. And how do they start that journey? Well, they can link out to suppliers like us, read our literature, understand, have our discussions, join our webinars. In fact, join this podcast. There's lots of different mechanisms.
Absolutely. And that should be a win-win proposition for any CFO. And thank you so much, Mike and John, for your brilliant insights today and for taking part in this second episode of the special series of podcasts with Siemens Digital Industries Software. Thank you so much for joining today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you've really enjoyed this episode. What were your key takeaways? We'd love to hear your feedback, and don't forget to follow us on social media to know when the next episode of this special series drops on energyconnects.com. I'll be back with more episodes of the Energy Connects podcast. Stay tuned.